Okay, this is lab activity number 12, instrumentation strokes, angulation, and calculus removal. The first part of this lab activity is to demonstrate a horizontal, oblique, and vertical stroke. We're going to apply those strokes on this first molar of quad 3, starting with a horizontal stroke. For a horizontal stroke, you want to make sure that the toe of your instrument, so this part, is directed towards the sulcus. We apply these strokes for this tooth only at the line angles, so distal line angle and mesial line angle, keeping that toe of the instrument directed towards the base of the pocket. Next is an oblique stroke. Those are diagonal strokes. We apply those on the straight buccal, straight lingual. So they would look like this, oblique strokes. And next is a vertical stroke. Vertical strokes are applied on the distal and the mesial of this tooth. So starting with the distal, vertical stroke, and the mesial, vertical stroke. The next part of the lab activity has you use a piece of chalk and demonstrate an assessment stroke, a calculus removal stroke, and a root debridement stroke. The first stroke that I'll demonstrate is the assessment stroke using your 11-12 Explorer. When you apply an assessment stroke correctly, very little or no chalk should be removed. One thing that is important is that you always have a fulcrum. So I like to fulcrum on the side of the chalk, which is more realistic to fulcruming on the opposing tooth. And then for the end of the Explorer, you can see that end of the Explorer is pointing away from the chalk. If I switch that, this one is curving towards the chalk. So this is the correct end to use. And then your assessment stroke is very light pressure in your grasp, very little to no chalk should be removed with that stroke. Next is the calculus removal stroke with the Barnhart. And this one, same thing, we're gonna look at the working end, and you can see that end is pointing away from the chalk. So we want to use the opposite. This end is correct. And with a calculus removal stroke, it's a short biting stroke. And with the chalk, you should have just short, deep chunk of chalk removed. So that would look something like this. You want to increase the pressure in your grasp, short, so only 1 millimeter or 2 with your stroke, biting stroke, and at the end, your chalk will have probably a little divot. Then the next one is the root debridement stroke. We're going to demonstrate with that with the Barnhart 5.6 also. And when you do a root debridement stroke, you're going to have light to moderate pressure. You should have a shallow linear groove made in the chalk. So that would look something like this. So not as much pressure as the calculus removal stroke, but more pressure than an assessment stroke. You can see the chalk is coming off, but a longer linear stroke. So your chalk will look something like this at the end of that. Next, you will demonstrate correct angulation for calculus removal on a distal surface, buccal surface, lingual surface, and mesial surface. Starting with the distal surface, I always think it's easiest to start at 90 degrees. So 90 degrees, you will see that the lower shank is parallel to the long axis of the tooth. And 90 degrees is not the right angulation for calculus removal. We would like 70 to 80 degrees for calculus removal. So the easiest way to achieve that is just to bring the instrument blade closed. You can look at the heel of the instrument. It's going to come closer to the tooth surface for 70 to 80. We're not going to exaggerate it too far. So 90, 70 to 80. Correct angulation for a calculus removal stroke. Looking at the mesial surface, it looks very similar. So starting again at 90 degrees, and to get to 70 to 80, you can watch the heel is going to come closer to the tooth. You can also see the handle's going to come up when you get the correct angulation. So 90, 70 to 80 degrees, which is correct for this surface. Looking at the buccal and lingual surfaces, we're again starting with 90 degrees. So it's gonna look something like this. And again, watch the heel. The heel is gonna come closer to the tooth when you close in on 70 to 80 degrees. Last, the lingual surface. On the lingual, just looking at the angle of the instrument. So 90 degrees is about here. The blade is open. The heel is away from the tooth. When we close that angle to 70 to 80, the heel gets closer to the tooth. The blade closes in on the tooth as well. The last part of the lab activity asks you to perform a calculus removal stroke using a Barnhart 5-6 on a posterior tooth, and perform an assessment stroke using an 11-12 Explorer on an anterior tooth. For the posterior tooth, we are on the buccal of quad 4 using that Barnhart, and we're going to apply the things that we've learned. So the short biting stroke with the correct angulation. So you can check your angulation again, 90, close in at 70 to 80, and your short biting stroke. If you want to see that on the buccal, you'll also kind of notice that there's a sound that comes with the correct calculus removal stroke. Should be listening for that and hearing that. You'll also notice my fingers are blanching a little bit because there's more pressure in the grasp with a calculus removal stroke. When we switch to the 11-12 Explorer on an anterior tooth, you want an assessment stroke. So remember the things we learned in this lab activity with an assessment stroke. We want very light pressure in the grasp. So we don't want to see the fingers blanch, and very light pressure with the stroke. Should hear little to no sound with that stroke.